Have you ever had that feeling, like where you just get it? You see what's going to happen, you're ready for whatever's next.
Yeah.
That's what situational awareness can feel like. And it's not like some superpower for, secret agents or athletes.
Right.
It's something that you are using every single day, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah.
And today we're going to deep dive into situational awareness and hopefully give you some, practical insights into how you can be more aware without being overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, and I think for this one, we've got a really interesting set of sources. We're drawing on discussions from podcasts focused on things like project management and healthcare,
Yep.
personal safety, even hockey goalkeeping.
Interested in
We've
that.
got insights from experts in human factors and error prevention.
Wow. So we're all over the map with this.
We are, but I think it all kind of ties together.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating topic, and I'm really excited to dive in.
Me too.
So the goal today is to come away with a clear understanding of what situational awareness is, give you some actual strategies you can use
Yes.
to actually hone your skills in situational awareness,
Yep.
and just help everyone appreciate why it's so important.
Yeah.
So let's just get right into it. What is situational awareness?
Well, in the simplest terms, it's knowing what is going on around you and thinking ahead.
Okay.
The Canadian Medical Protective Association, they're an organization focused on physician safety and practice. They break it down into 3 key steps:
Okay.
gathering information, understanding its significance, and then using that understanding to anticipate potential complications.
So it's not just sort of passive observation.
No.
It's like active thinking.
Exactly. It's taking in that information and then understanding it within the context of the situation.
And it's so interesting how this concept comes up even in like the least expected places.
Right.
We're looking at hockey.
Yeah.
They talk about this in hockey.
Yeah. And so, you think about a hockey goalie and they talk about things like hockey IQ or hockey sense. And really what that is, reading the play, anticipating the play, all of that is situational awareness.
So a goalie who has a good situational awareness can, track where all the players are, where the puck is, and sort of intuit where things might go next.
Exactly. And that, that ability to kind of be one step ahead.
But, one of the sources we were looking at was a podcast specifically for goalies.
Right.
Made a really interesting distinction
Okay.
between anticipation and what they call cheating. So what is that all about?
Well, they're talking about, how a goalie might start to cheat towards one side of the net.
Right.
If they see, a player winding up for a shot or a pass.
Right.
But true anticipation is more about, taking in all that information and then still keeping that primary focus on the puck. Because,
Right.
players can fake you out. They can look one way and pass the other, so you can't commit too early.
Right. So it's like being aware, but not overcommitting based on,
Okay.
a potential feint.
Right.
Now, our source on project management, they presented this really interesting framework that had 3 distinct levels of situational awareness.
Yeah.
So what are those levels?
So they broke it down this way. They said level 1 is all about correctly reading the data.
Okay.
Right. So you're taking in that raw information, but you're registering what it means.
Okay.
Level 2 then is about assessing the current situation based on that data.
All right. So you've got the information. What does it mean right now?
Exactly.
What does it mean right now?
And then level 3 is where you start to project future possibilities.
Okay. So this is where you're taking all that information and then trying to, predict what's going to happen.
Right. It's not fortune telling. It's not,
Right.
you have a crystal ball. It's about taking what you know
Mm-hmm.
and then making those informed predictions
Okay.
and being flexible enough to adapt if things change.
So it's like informed guessing,
Yeah.
but based on what's happening.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Another one of our sources talked about the perception comprehension projection loop.
Yeah.
That sounds like a core idea here.
It is. It's the cycle through which we maintain situational awareness.
Okay.
So first, we perceive information
Okay.
from our surroundings.
Right.
Second, we comprehend that information. We make sense of it.
Got it.
And then third, we anticipate future states
Okay.
based on that understanding.
I see.
And it's not a one-way street. It's a continuous feedback loop.
Okay.
Our projections can actually influence what we pay attention to,
Oh, that's interesting.
right? So, you think about driving a car,
Okay, yeah.
you perceive the brake lights ahead of you,
Yep.
you comprehend that the car is slowing down.
Right.
And so you project that you might need to brake as well.
Right.
And then, based on how that car slows down, you might adjust your braking.
I see. So your projections change as you're getting more information? That makes sense. Can you think of another real-world example of that comprehension projection loop?
Yeah. Well, the Taproot podcast, which focuses on root cause analysis and safety,
Okay.
they use the miracle on the Hudson
Oh, wow.
as an example.
Okay.
And so, the pilots perceived the sudden engine failure after hitting the birds.
Right.
They comprehended the implications of that loss of power, rapid descent.
Right.
Based on that, they projected their limited options.
Yeah.
They realized they couldn't reach a nearby airport.
Right.
And that led to their decision to land in the Hudson.
Wow.
But you can see that loop in action.
Yeah. Right.
They were constantly getting new information.
Yeah.
Altitude, airspeed, glide ratio.
Yeah.
Recomprehending their situation.
Yeah.
Adjusting their projections and actions.
Right. So the loop is like constantly cycling. It's not just like a one-time thing.
Well,
that's really fascinating. Now, I think some people might hear all this talk about awareness and, think, well, this sounds kind of paranoid.
Right.
Like, am I supposed to be constantly on edge and,
Sure.
kind of freaked out about everything?
Well, and the Art of Manliness podcast actually addressed that directly.
Okay.
And they made the point that being aware is the opposite of being paranoid.
Okay, that's interesting.
Paranoia is often, unfounded suspicions and anxiety.
Right.
Not based on evidence.
Right.
Situational awareness is grounded in, observation and understanding your environment.
Okay.
So you're able to assess, when it's appropriate to relax.
Right.
Because you've determined that it's safe.
Right.
Or when you need to be more vigilant.
So it's about informed vigilance, not just like,
Exactly.
constant fear.
Right.
Okay, so what are some of the factors that influence our situational awareness?
Well, it often starts with ourselves.
Okay.
Our internal context, that, our mental and emotional state.
Mm-hmm.
That has a big impact on, how well we perceive and process information.
Makes sense.
Things like lack of sleep stress, feeling unwell.
Yeah.
All of that can really affect our attentiveness.
Right. So if you're exhausted, you're not going to be as,
Exactly.
on top of things.
The decision making is not going to be as sharp.
So being aware of our own internal state is really important.
Yeah, it's foundational.
Okay, so that's internal. What about external factors?
Well, our personal safety expert talked about the importance of establishing an external baseline.
Okay, what does that mean?
They called it the 3-point check system.
Okay.
Places, people, plans.
Okay, I like it.
Right, so it's about scanning your environment, those places.
Yeah.
Observing the individuals, those people.
Okay.
Thinking about basic contingency plans.
Right.
Just those plans.
So, as you were saying that, I was thinking about even like my commute this morning.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm doing some version of this even without thinking about it.
Probably, yeah.
Subconsciously. Uh-huh.
So let's break these down a bit. What do we mean when we talk about places?
So for places, it's about looking at those key structural elements,
Okay.
like entry and exit points,
Okay.
emergency exits,
Right.
potential hiding spots, both for yourself and for others.
Right.
So, a lot of times when I go into a new building, one of the first things I do is I look for the fire exits.
Right.
Just in case.
That's a good idea. Okay, so you're getting the layout of the land.
Exactly.
Okay, how about people?
So with people, it's about observing their behavior
Okay.
and not making assumptions about their character.
Right.
So it's about looking for those early warning signs.
Okay.
Are they unusually agitated?
Right.
Aggressive body language? Do they seem out of place?
Right.
But our expert cautioned against what's called hindsight bias.
Oh, yeah. What is that?
That's where after an incident, people tend to say, oh, I knew something was off.
Right, right.
But they didn't consciously register it at the time.
Right. True situational awareness is about being present.
Right.
Actively observing in the moment.
Not just, Monday morning quarterbacking.
Exactly.
Okay, so the third part of the 3-point check system is plans.
Right.
So what are we talking about here?
So these don't have to be complex strategies.
Okay.
The podcast talked about run, hide, fight, communicate
Okay.
as a basic model.
Right.
Right. It aligns with, those adrenal responses, fight, flight, freeze.
Right.
But it also includes that communication piece, which is so important.
Right.
So it's about mentally rehearsing those basic responses.
Okay.
Knowing when to run,
Right.
when to hide, when to fight,
When to communicate.
and how to communicate.
Right.
Whether it's, de-escalating the situation,
Yeah.
warning others,
Right.
contacting authorities.
So it's having that plan in place so that if something happens,
Right.
you're not just, frozen
Exactly.
like a deer in the headlights. Okay, so our healthcare source brought up this idea of human factors
Yes.
and how that influences situational awareness
Wait.
in a healthcare setting.
Right.
So what are human factors?
So in healthcare, it's really looking at how individuals, teams, and the environment all interact.
Okay.
And the environment includes both the physical aspects, like, the layout of a room, the design of equipment,
Yeah.
but also those human elements,
Okay.
team culture, leadership communication practices.
Okay.
So all of that really impacts, how aware healthcare professionals are of a patient's condition,
That makes sense.
the overall situation.
And it sounds like, the patient is really central.
Absolutely. The CMPA Good Practices document
Mm.
emphasizes that the patient is the most important element.
Okay.
And there's unchanging information about the patient, like their name, past medical history.
Right.
But there's also that dynamic information.
Okay.
Vital signs, symptoms,
Yeah.
how their condition is evolving
So keeping track of all that.
is crucial.
That's a lot. Okay, so we talked about what it is, what influences it.
Yeah.
How do we actually get better?
One fundamental thing is active information gathering.
Okay.
So it's about consciously paying attention
Okay.
to all the sources of information around you.
Okay.
So, in a healthcare setting,
Yeah.
this might mean carefully reviewing a patient's chart,
Okay.
listening to the patient and their family,
Right.
paying attention to notes from other professionals,
Okay.
participating in briefings.
Right.
For our hockey goalie, this translates to looking off the puck
Right.
to see where the other players are.
Right. To see the whole ice, not just the puck.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's one thing, being active in your gathering of information.
Right.
Another one was this idea of conscious cognitive processing.
Yeah.
What is that?
So it's about shifting your thinking from, that automatic pattern recognition,
Okay.
kind of that autopilot mode,
Right.
to a more intentional analytical approach,
I see.
particularly when you're faced with something challenging or unfamiliar.
So it's like slowing down,
Yeah.
thinking it through,
Exactly.
not just reacting.
And the healthcare source talked about how, using the process of creating a differential diagnosis
Okay.
can help with that.
Okay.
So, if a patient presents with certain symptoms,
Yeah.
systematically considering all the possible explanations for those symptoms,
Right.
that forces you to slow down,
Yeah.
really engage your brain,
Yeah.
and not jump to conclusions.
So it's not just like, oh, I've seen this before, I know what it is. It's like, wait,
Right.
let's think this through.
What are all the possibilities?
Okay, cool. And our hockey source talked about cognitive training
Yeah.
as a way to improve awareness.
Right.
What kind of exercises are we talking about here?
Well, things like concentration grids.
Okay.
Those can help sharpen your focus.
Okay.
And visual scanning skills,
Okay.
even board games.
Oh, really?
Like Cranium or Pictionary.
Interesting.
Those require, strategic thinking and planning.
Right.
And they can actually be beneficial for this.
That's cool.
Even reading,
Oh, okay.
reading books.
Reading can make you better at everything.
It really can.
So it's about that overall cognitive fitness.
It is.
Now, the Goalie podcast also brought up this idea of looking off the puck.
Yes.
How can we apply that to other areas of our lives?
So, obviously that's a hockey-specific term.
Right.
But the principle behind it is really transferable.
Okay.
It's about shifting your focus
Okay.
from the most immediate stimulus
Okay.
to gather broader information.
Right. So it's not just about what's right in front of you.
Right.
It's like what's in your peripheral vision.
Exactly.
Okay. So it's like, not being glued to your phone when you're walking down the street.
Right.
Look up.
Exactly.
See what's going on around you.
Or in a meeting,
Yeah.
Pay attention not just to the person speaking, but also the body language of the other people
Right.
in the room.
Okay. So broadening your attention.
Yes.
Okay. Another strategy is pattern recognition.
Yeah.
How do we get better at recognizing patterns?
Well, it really comes down to experience and exposure.
Okay.
The more you interact with a particular environment,
Yeah.
whether it's, a project team, traffic, social interactions,
Right.
the better you become at recognizing those recurring patterns.
So it's like practice.
It is. It's like anything else. The more you do it, the better you get at it.
So how do we practice that?
Well, the Goalie podcast suggested, watch the game in your area of interest.
Okay.
But not just passively.
Right.
Actively engage with it.
Okay, so how do we actively engage?
Take notes.
Okay.
Try to predict what's going to happen next.
All right.
Do a mental play-by-play.
Okay.
The more you immerse yourself,
Right.
the stronger that ability will become.
So it's about being present and thinking it through.
Exactly.
Okay, another strategy that came up was seeking different perspectives.
Yeah.
Why is that important?
Well, talking to other people,
Okay.
teammates, colleagues,
Yeah.
friends,
Yeah.
they might see things that you miss.
Right.
They might interpret things differently.
Right.
They might anticipate things that you don't.
Because they have their own perspective.
Exactly.
And it's not just, talking to people who agree with you.
No, you want those diverse viewpoints.
Right, because they might see something that you're just blind to.
Exactly.
Okay. Video analysis was another thing that came up.
Yes.
How can that help us?
So breaking down video footage, whether it's of yourself or of others,
Okay.
allows for really detailed analysis.
Okay.
So you can go back,
Right.
identify cues you missed,
Yeah.
understand the decision-making processes,
Right.
pinpoint areas for improvement.
So it's like having a replay
It is.
for your life.
You can slow it down, you can pause it, you can really analyze it.
Okay.
It's a great learning tool.
Okay. Simulations and scenario-based training also came up.
Yeah.
Why are those so important?
They provide safe environments to practice,
Okay.
responding to uncertain or emergency situations.
Right.
The Tapper Tabcast used the example of a fire drill.
Right.
It's essentially a simulation.
Yeah.
We learn those responses so we can react effectively if there's a real fire.
Right.
And scenario-based training is especially important for those,
Yeah.
unexpected events.
Right.
It helps you build those knowledge-based decision-making skills.
So it's not just about reading the manual.
Yeah.
It's about actually experiencing
Right.
a version of it.
Exactly.
Okay. Our healthcare source talked about managing cognitive biases.
Yeah.
What are cognitive biases?
So these are, patterns of deviation in our thinking.
Okay.
They can lead to distortion
Okay.
and interfere with our ability to assess a situation accurately.
So these are like mental shortcuts that our brains take.
But that can sometimes lead us astray.
Exactly.
Okay, so what are some examples of those biases?
Well, there's confirmation bias, where we tend to seek out information that confirms what we already believe
Right.
and ignore information that contradicts it.
Right.
There's anchoring bias, where we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we get,
Okay,
even if it's not the most reliable.
I see.
So being aware of these biases can help us counteract them,
Right.
make more objective assessments.
So it's like being aware of your own blind spots.
Exactly.
Okay. In teams, like healthcare or project management, communication is so important.
It's vital for what's called shared situational awareness,
Okay.
where everyone on the team has a similar understanding of what's going on.
Okay.
So using tools like SBR, situation, background assessment recommendation,
Right.
can be really helpful.
Okay.
Conducting team huddles
Right.
to share updates,
Yeah.
clarify understanding.
And fostering that culture where everyone feels safe to speak up
Right.
if they have a concern.
So it's about, making sure everyone's on the same page.
It is.
And that everyone feels comfortable speaking up.
Exactly.
Okay, and then finally, continuous improvement.
Yes.
Why is debriefing after events so important?
Debriefing provides a valuable opportunity to reflect and learn.
Okay.
So after any event or procedure, whether it went well or not,
Right.
you discuss what happened,
Okay.
what went well, what could have been done differently.
Right.
You know why certain decisions were made.
Right.
And that helps you identify areas for improvement
I see.
and build systems that promote better ongoing situational awareness.
So it's like that continuous learning and adaptation.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about, why it's important in healthcare. We've talked about hockey. What about in project management?
So in project management, it's really crucial for understanding that broader context.
Right.
The political landscape, the strategic goals, potential roadblocks.
Right, so it's not just about the project in isolation.
Right.
It's about how the project fits into the larger
The big picture.
organization.
Yes.
Okay, and then personal safety was another big one.
Yeah, and the Art of Manliness podcast argued that we should actually spend more time on awareness than self-defense.
Interesting.
Because in a physical attack, you only have a fraction of a second to react.
Right.
So recognizing and avoiding dangerous situations,
Yeah.
that's your best defense.
So awareness is prevention.
It is.
Okay, and then what about high-risk industries?
So, aviation, law enforcement, logging,
Right.
These are environments where you know things can change quickly.
Right.
The stakes are high.
Huge. Yeah.
And, those perception, comprehension, projection skills
Hmm.
are absolutely essential.
Because mistakes could be catastrophic.
Exactly.
But, as we're talking about all this, it's clear that situational awareness isn't just for, fighter pilots and surgeons.
Right. It's a life skill for everyone.
It is for everybody.
It helps us navigate the world more effectively and safely.
So as we wrap up here, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is that situational awareness is a learnable skill.
Okay.
It's not something you're born with.
Right.
It's about paying attention, making sense of information, thinking ahead.
Okay.
And even small efforts can make a big difference
I love it.
in your life.
So to leave our listeners with some food for thought,
Yeah.
think about how you gather information in your daily life.
Yeah.
How often do you stop and really observe your surroundings
Uh-huh.
without distractions?
Good question.
And what's one small thing you can do this week
Yeah.
to be just a little bit more aware?
I love it.
So think about that. And if any of the things that we talked about today really resonated with you, whether it was that 3-point check system, the cognitive exercises, team communication,
Yeah.
go learn more.
Explore it.
There's always more to discover.
There is.
Awesome. Well, this has been a fascinating dive, as always.
It has.
I'm so glad we got to explore this together.
Me too.
Until next time.
See ya.